Major funding for Crucible of Empire was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Funding was also provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
McKinley did not want war.
The idea of Cuban independence had taken hold.
On the other hand, he wanted things that only war could give him.
The Spanish were not going to get out, and they were not on the run.
He wanted a peaceful Cuba. He wanted U.S. control of the Caribbean. He wanted a naval base in the Spanish colony of the Philippines.
McKinley called for volunteers, then I got my gun. First Spaniard I saw coming, I shot him on the run. It was all about that battleship of Maine.
I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one.
Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt thought that a war with Spain over Cuba would make us a world power.
At war with that great nation Spain. When I get through with Spain, I will have honored my name. It was all about that battleship of Maine.
The Americans always felt that deep in his heart, the Cuban wanted to be a part of the United States.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their liberators, but when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos became suspicious of American motives.
It was all about that battleship of Maine.
Singing in the trolley car, what a jolly crowd they are. Jenny Long sings a song, Johnny Ray plays the guitar, Sadie Mae and Sturdy Jim.
1890s America. The nation headed full speed into a new industrial age. At the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, millions gathered to celebrate the innovations that powered American productivity. Incandescent lights, efficient farming methods, modern railways, a faster printing press. Visitors could even taste the promise of the next century. Cracker Jacks, diet soda, and the hamburger made their American debut.
I cherish the thought that America stands on the threshold of a great awakening. The impulse with which this phantom city could rise in our midst is proof that the Spirit is with us. President Grover Cleveland, opening day, May 1st, 1893.
Only a few days after the fair opened, the nation was hit by the worst financial crisis in its history. Stocks plummeted, businesses went bankrupt, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. In a lecture at the exposition, the young historian Frederick Jackson Turner suggested that the solution for the United States could be found beyond its borders.
The colonization of the Great West did indeed furnish a new field of opportunity, but never again will such gifts of free lands offer themselves. The frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history.
And the frontier gone, there was something akin to a panic among people. Geez, if American institutions can't expand, they're going to shrink. We had to find some new outlet for our energy, for our dynamic nature, for this coiled spring that was the United States. So there was an intellectual justification, rationalization would be a better way to put it, for let's get our power overseas.
At the same time, there was an imperial race taking off in the world. Great Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and a new Japan that was just emerging as a world power at this time, were all engaged in colonial enterprises.
Spain once ruled a great global empire. It encompassed most of Central and South America and a large portion of North America. As civil wars crippled Spanish authority, many colonies broke free. In the 1890s, all that remained of Spain's possessions were Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, and a few scattered islands.
By the 1890s, Spain was considered very low in the estimation of many, many Americans. Spaniards had been looming around our country through our formation years, and somehow we always felt a threat from them. They were not part of either the Anglo-Saxon culture or French culture, and so we always saw Spain as being almost a subhuman European peoples.
Through most of the 19th century, Spain's dwindling colonial revenue flowed from Cuba's sugar and slave trade. U.S. politicians since John Quincy Adams had eyed Spain's prized possession.
If an apple, severed by a tempest from its native tree, cannot choose but fall to the ground, Cuba, forcibly disjoined from Spain, can gravitate only towards the North American Union.
I'm on my way to Cuba, that's where I'm going. Cuba, that's where I'll stay.
In 1868, Cuban sugar planters, oppressed by increasing Spanish taxes, took up arms to win their independence. They seized much of eastern Cuba, freeing the slaves and destroying the sugar mills that had profited Spain. The commander of the rebel army was General Máximo Gómez.
Máximo Gómez was born in the Dominican Republic, and he came to Cuba as a Spanish soldier. That is the irony of the situation, because as soon as he arrived in Cuba, he defected and started organizing the Cubans. He tried to get them to use tactics and to train, things which were novel to the insurgents at the time.
The revolt known as the 10 Years' War failed to win the Cubans their independence. But the struggle for Cuba Libre, a free Cuba, continued, as Spanish promises for reform were never fulfilled. Gómez withdrew to his native Dominican Republic, leaving the Spanish with a depressed sugar industry. Spain could not afford to lend money to Cuban planters. Many turned to the United States.
Way down in Cuba where skies are clear, where it is summertime all of the year, they have the love.
Through 1895, as Americans visited and invested in Cuba, Cubans moved to the United States to study and work.
Shake it up, side.
It is in these years that we see the first significant Cuban immigration setting up, first in Florida, and then New York City, in Philadelphia, and Boston, and Washington. This period is critical to the formation of Cuban national identity, the means by which Cubans begin to articulate the discontent, their angst with the Spanish colonial system.
Baseball soon became a national obsession in Cuba. The North American sport provided a welcome alternative to traditional Spanish entertainment.
And so we have this counterpoint on one hand between baseball and bullfighting. And bullfighting represents the colonial regime. It's bloody, it's individual, it's singular. It seems to attract into the Havana Bull Ring mostly the Spaniards. Baseball is to be modern, to be progressive. It is not to be Spanish. Coincidentally, some of the most important leaders of the Cuban insurrectionary movement are ball players who leave the ball field to take to the field of an armed struggle.
The revolution began anew in 1895 under the visionary leadership of José Martí. A Cuban poet and journalist living in New York, Martí visited Cuban communities across the United States to promote and raise funds for Cuban independence. His ideas reshaped Cuba Libre.
Martí realizes that the weakness of the previous attempt at independence was that Cuba was not united. It was divided by class, it was divided by race, and so he decides to mobilize the exiled community and to tell them that the cause of Cuba is one of all Cubans wherever they are.
Either the Republic is founded upon the integral character of every one of its sons, or the Republic is not worth one of our mother's tears, or a single drop of our hero's blood. Will we fear the Negro? The black man has drawn his noble body to its full height and is becoming a solid column for his native liberties. Others may fear him. I love him. José Martí.
He basically argues that black Cubans and white Cubans had come together, that going back to the 10 Years' War, their blood had joined in the fields of battle, and that because of that history, race had been superseded, it had been transcended. It no longer divided Cubans, which for the 1890s, it's a remarkable statement.
In April 1895, Martí joined 60-year-old General Máximo Gómez in the Dominican Republic. They hitched a ride aboard a German banana boat, then rode to the rocky shores of southeast Cuba to lead the rebellion. The travelers hacked their way through dense jungle to make contact with insurgent forces.
Martí was radiant with pride and satisfaction because he was able to hold his own in all this with 5 rugged men, General Máximo Gómez.
A month later, despite warnings from General Gómez, Martí rode ahead of his troops and was killed in his first battle. Cuban insurgents gathered strength from his martyrdom. They reclaimed the eastern provinces that they had occupied during the 10 Years' War. Gómez now knew that the insurrection against Spain would only succeed if taken to Cuba's wealthiest provinces. Gómez pushed westward. His objective, Havana.
All plantations shall be totally destroyed, their cane and outbuildings burned. Laborers who shall aid the sugar factory shall be considered traitors to their country and shall be shot. General Máximo Gómez.
A new Spanish colonial governor, General Valeriano Weyler, was sent to Havana to stop General Gómez. Weyler faced a rebel army that operated with the support of peasant farmers. He forcibly reconcentrated the rural population.
The aim of the policy is to gather people not involved in the army who were living in the countryside and put them into towns where their services would not be available to the Cuban rebels. A lot of people go into these towns, and the towns are notoriously like concentration camps. Nobody really knows how many people died, but they range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands.
Images of Weyler's camps were supplied to U.S. newspapers by rebel sympathizers in New York.
The Americans needed somebody to personify the perfidious Spanish. And they couldn't look to the King of Spain at this time, Alfonso XIII, because he was a 14-year-old kid. His mother, who was the Queen Regent, was an Austrian princess, not very Spanish. But here was this Weyler.
General Weyler was the perfect villain. He was portrayed brutally in cartoons and editorials and news stories as a savage, inhumane brute, as the most bloodthirsty butcher that had ever entered this hemisphere.
Weyler is a fiendish despot, a brute, a devastator of haciendas, pitiless, cold, an exterminator of men. There is nothing to prevent his carnal brain from inventing torture and infamies of bloody debauchery. The New York Journal, February 1896.
The journal's new editor was William Randolph Hearst, the 33-year-old son of a successful California gold miner. Hearst had purchased the failing journal in 1895. He quickly made it the most influential newspaper in New York.
Everyone expected he would just be another rich man's son. He was a rich man's son. He was also one of the most brilliant newspaper men this country has ever seen. I think Hearst truly, truly believed that he could establish himself as a power, not only in New York and in journalistic circles, but maybe nationally, if he could play the Cuba story the way he wanted to play it.
I think Hearst took up the Cuban independence movement as a jingoistic way to bring America together. We were a nation in that period that was at each other's throats. North was still angry at South. Populist farmers didn't like East Coast bankers. We had economic depression, which created a panic. And Hearst saw that the way to pull everybody together was with some war.
Now, you go to war, it pulls the country together, and it gets everybody fascinated. And we all glue to the tube nowadays to watch CNN if the war is coming on. Well, they got the Hearst papers.
U.S. businessmen saw war as a threat to their investments in Cuba and to economic recovery at home. Their concerns were shared by Republican President-elect William McKinley. As governor of Ohio, McKinley had pushed for a stronger tariff to restore the nation's prosperity. He declared his stance on Cuba in his 1897 inaugural address.
We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every agency of peace has failed.
McKinley served as a 19-year-old sergeant during the Battle of Antietam in 1862.
He was the last American president to have served in the Civil War, and he knew what war was like. At one point he said, "I've been through one war. I've seen the bodies stacked like cordwood, and I don't want to go through that sort of thing again."
I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. If we lose our virile, manly qualities and sink into a nation of mere hucksters, then we shall indeed reach a condition worse than that of the ancient civilizations in the years of their decay. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt.
From his boxing days at Harvard to his term as New York City's police commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt was a fighter. Unlike President McKinley, Roosevelt advocated a war with Spain.
I think this reflected the fact that Roosevelt's generation had not fought a war. The generation of its parents had fought the Civil War and demonstrated its bravery and its valor then. Roosevelt's generation still had to prove its worth.
It's something that I feel myself. I was born in 1935, and I grew up listening to World War II stories, and I feel cheated that I wasn't a part of that. And so there was a feeling of, it's our turn. We want to get out there and be heroes.
Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt was a tremendous admirer of Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, the president of the Naval War College. Mahan's books and articles pushed for a stronger Navy.
As a nation launches forth, the need is soon felt for a foothold in a foreign land, a new outlet for what it has to sell, a new sphere for its shipping. The ships that thus sail must have secure ports and the protection of a navy.
Now his cap with the peak is as glossy and sleek as a cap could ever be, and it sits on his hair with a jauntiful air of a naval nicety, and his collar so tight and his trousers of white and the shoes that rival glass. He's a chap so smart that he...
Congress authorized funds to modernize the Navy, which had hardly been updated since the Civil War.
And salute the festive meeting.
The idea was our Navy's an antiquated joke. We've got to do something about it. And the something was the Industrial Revolution, steel. Cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago had steel. And to make, if not the largest Navy in the world, at least a new Navy to not only defend both parts of American shore, but to defend American economic interest around the globe.
The United States needed such a policy that we were a two-ocean country, that we had to have a fleet that could patrol both oceans, that this was going to require coaling stations and outposts out there. And if America wanted to take her place as one of the great nations of the world, she had to get into the imperialist race and had to acquire colonies. And this had a tremendous appeal to young men like Theodore Roosevelt.
Theodore Roosevelt and other people in the Navy Department understood that although the cause of war was the situation in Cuba, the war would be against Spain. And anything Spain could bring to bear in that war would be something that American forces should attack. The Spanish fleet was located in the Philippines. The Philippines had harbors that were worthwhile. The Philippines commanded the water routes between China and Southeast Asia. So to the few people, the Philippines meant something.
For she's the belle of all Manila, my Filipina queen. She's won me with the brightness of her smile. An Orient...
Spain had ruled the Philippines since the early 1500s. While over 1,000 islands in the Philippines were inhabited, the capital of Manila dominated culture and commerce. Sugar, hemp, and tobacco were shipped through Manila to the markets of China. But unlike Cuba, whose sugar industry created great wealth for Spain, the Philippines produced little revenue. Spanish missionaries forced the Filipinos to convert to Catholicism and collected taxes on their most fertile lands. Filipinos who pressed for reforms ended up in dungeons or executed. Under the flag of the Katipunan, or Society of the Sons of the People, 20,000 Filipinos staged an uprising in 1896.
They had had too much of Spanish oppression, too much of Spanish control. They had lost virtually their rights and they were living as second-class citizens. And therefore, Filipinos who had held sporadic revolts before 1896 culminated and got together to launch a major nationwide revolution against the Spaniards.
27-year-old Emilio Aguinaldo, the son of a wealthy landowner, rose through the ranks of the revolutionary movement. Aguinaldo became president of the Katipunan in the spring of 1897.
Filipino citizens, let us follow the example of European and American nations. Let us march under the flag of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
With 200,000 troops fighting in Cuba, Spain could not afford a war in the Philippines. Spanish officials approached Aguinaldo with a bid for peace.
And one of the conditions was for the revolutionaries, the leadership anyway, to be exiled to Hong Kong and to be paid a sum of money. And then certain reforms should be instituted in the Philippines.
Though Aguinaldo did not believe that the Spanish would implement the reforms, he needed the money for food and supplies. Aguinaldo agreed to embark for Hong Kong. There, he would purchase arms for shipment back to the Philippines.
To the extent that Americans knew that there was an insurgency in the Philippines, there was a vague sympathy and support. Americans have been at least rhetorically supportive of anti-colonialist, anti-imperial movements from the time of the American Revolution. Compared to the insurgency in Cuba, which Americans knew all about, the Philippines were really a blank spot in the American public's perception.
Through 1897, the New York newspapers portrayed Cuba as a damsel in distress, Uncle Sam as her gallant savior, and Spain as the villain, in an intriguing romance of war. And every romance has its troubadour. Hearst's was Richard Harding Davis.
Richard Harding Davis was a brilliant writer, but more than that, he was an incredible character. Hearst paid him $3,000 a month plus expenses, which was absolutely phenomenal.
As the international correspondent for Harper's Weekly, Davis had journeyed through the Middle East and Central America. For the New York Journal, Davis cabled back stories from Cuba that flared his readers' imaginations. One story described the young Adolfo Rodriguez, sentenced to die for joining the Cuban rebellion.
The officer of the firing squad whipped up his sword. The men leveled their rifles. The sword dropped, and the men fired. The Cuban sank on his side without a struggle or sound and did not move again. At that moment, the sun shot up suddenly from behind them, and the whole world seemed to wake to welcome the day. But the figure of the young Cuban was asleep in the wet grass, his arms still tightly bound behind him, and the blood from his breast sinking into the soil that he had tried to free. Richard Harding Davis.
President McKinley read a dozen newspapers a day. Like millions of Americans, he was touched by Hearst's portrayal of Evangelina Cisneros, a convent-educated Cuban teenager imprisoned by the Spanish in Havana.
Hearst set up an international campaign to get prominent women all over the world to send telegrams to Spain demanding the release of Ms. Cisneros.
Julia Ward Howe, the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, wrote an impassioned letter to the Pope.
We implore you, Holy Father, to induce the Spanish government to abstain from this act of military vengeance.
President McKinley's mother added her name to the cause. All this continued to sell newspapers, but it didn't affect Cisneros' release. She continued to languish in this Cuban prison.
They arranged an escape attempt. This was done by William Randolph Hearst, who got a hunk of a man named Carl Decker to arrange this escape. And he rented the house next door and put a plank across to the window of the prison where she was and walked across and broke in that way and rescued her.
She reached out her hands to us with many little glad cries, rippling out in whispered Spanish benedictions for our efforts to save her.
They brought her out of Cuba, sailed her triumphantly into New York Harbor, and Hearst arranged one of the most triumphant series of events. She was feted at balls at the Waldorf, at dinners at Delmonico, brought to Washington, in the company of William Randolph Hearst.
I thought over what I would say to the president, that the women and children of Cuba must look to the great United States for protection. Then he came in. My poor speech for Cuba was forgotten, but I looked into the kind face of the president, and what I thought I saw there made me content. Evangelina Cisneros.
American men had rescued one Cuban woman, and the question that now faced the nation was, when would the United States free Cuba?
President McKinley appealed to the Spanish government to restore peace in Cuba and reviewed his military options. He invited Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt on a carriage ride through Washington.
McKinley had been very reluctant to appoint Roosevelt because he knew that Roosevelt was a hawk and was possibly likely to get us involved in a war. But Roosevelt took the opportunity to convey the fact that the U.S. Navy was very well prepared if they had to fight Spain over Cuba.
I urged getting our main fleet on the Cuban coast after war is declared, and at the same time throwing an expeditionary force into Cuba. I doubted if the war would last 6 weeks. Meanwhile, our Asiatic squadron should blockade and, if possible, take Manila. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt.
2 weeks later, the Spanish responded to President McKinley's demand for peace with what he considered significant concessions.
They do offer that if the Cubans will end the war, they will get the same political status of associated free state within the empire that Puerto Rico had. That is, they would have their own government.
But limited autonomy was unacceptable to Cuban insurgents. General Calixto Garcia, Gomez's second-in-command, rallied his troops to keep up the fight.
I regard autonomy only as a sign of Spain's weakening power and an indication that the end is not far off.
The Cubans were indeed within striking distance of defeating Spain. The Cubans almost controlled the entire countryside, certainly in the eastern end of the island and significant pockets of western Cuba. Spanish have now retreated from the small towns to the larger provincial cities and to the coastal points. One more rainy season, one more summer campaign would be enough to expel the Spanish from the island.
My own view is that the Spanish were not going to get out, and they were not on the run. The Cuban Revolution had been going on since 1868. This is 30 years later. And they don't appear to have been any closer to achieving the goal of getting the Spanish to march out of Havana and get on ships and go on home and say, you guys figure out how you want to run your lives, we're out of here. Spain was not even close to that.
Spanish officers in Havana balked at their government's willingness to negotiate. In January 1898, they took to the streets.
I believe that my government will reduce army officers to obedience. I want your president to keep America from helping the rebellion until the new plan of autonomy has had a fair chance. Maria Cristina, Queen Regent of Spain.
On January 24th, President McKinley ordered the battleship Maine to Havana to protect U.S. interests on the island. Spain's ambassador to Washington, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, was unimpressed with McKinley. A letter Dupuy de Lome had written to a friend in Havana was intercepted by Cuban revolutionaries and offered to the New York Herald.
McKinley is weak in catering to the rabble, and besides a low politician who desires to leave a door open to the jingos of his party.
The New York Herald needed a day at least to authenticate the letter. The Cubans said, you don't have a day. They took it to Hearst. Hearst published it immediately with huge, huge headlines. Greatest insult ever to America. Spanish insult our president. And the Hearst papers now demanded, and other papers as well, that war was the only recourse.
Before the Maine went down, mothers and matrons and sweethearts in hamlet and village and town prayed for and wrote to their darlings before the Maine went down.
On February 15, 1898, the Maine had been moored for 3 weeks in Havana Harbor without incident. The crew was anxious to return to the United States.
Captain Sigsbee, who was the commander of the Maine, later recalled that the Marine sergeant who played taps on the bugle was achieving some very elaborate flourishes with it that night. But the sense was tranquility, peaceful.
As sailors aboard the Maine began falling asleep, an explosion rocked the front end of the ship. At 11 p.m., Captain Sixby wired Washington.
Maine blown up in Havana Harbor at 9:40 tonight and destroyed. Many wounded and doubtless more killed or drowned.
The explosion aboard the Maine killed 266 U.S. sailors. The dead would be given a hero's burial in Arlington National Cemetery. The McKinley administration appointed a naval committee to investigate the cause of the tragedy. Many Americans had already made up their minds.
Hearst and the other papers blamed the Spanish for mining the ship and blowing it up. There was some evidence that that had happened, but whether that evidence was overwhelming or not, this was going to lead to the war that Hearst wanted in Cuba.
Hearst's journal proposed a regiment of athletes that would overawe the Spanish army with their mere physical presence. The New York World reported that an army of Indians under Buffalo Bill Cody would clear Spain out of Cuba in 60 days. Jesse James's brother, Frank, volunteered to lead a company of cowboys.
Every day brought new editorials claiming that the Americans had no choice now but to go to war, not only to avenge the Maine, but to save the Cubans from the treachery, the butchery of Spanish colonization.
People were supporting independence, were defending Cuban independence, were buying bonds for Cuban independence. The church pulpits in this country had come out in favor of Cuban independence. The proposition of freedom for the island had now seized the public imagination.
I don't propose to be swept off my feet by the catastrophe. We must learn the truth and endeavor, if possible, to fix the responsibility. The administration will go on preparing for war, but still hoping to avert it. President William McKinley.
Secretary of the Navy John Long shared McKinley's measured approach. Long made special efforts to meet with congressmen to discuss alternatives to war. One afternoon in late February, Long took time off and left Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt in charge. Roosevelt cabled Commodore George Dewey to gather his Asiatic squadron in Hong Kong, only 600 miles from the Philippine Islands.
That came very close to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy making the decision that we're going to take the Philippines as a part of this war against Spain, not necessarily against the president's wishes, but without the president's knowledge.
And so TR put it into action because his superior didn't want to take the initiative, nor did the president want to take the initiative. But when it was done, they let it stay, which was sort of a vindication that it was the wise thing.
President McKinley solicited from Congress $50 million for national defense.
It was reported in the press, both in this country and in Spain. And the Queen Regent was really impressed by the fact that McKinley could get $50 million to fight Spain simply by asking for it.
Vermont Senator Redfield Proctor, an affluent businessman and respected legislator, visited Cuba to evaluate the situation for himself.
Because it was known that he was close to McKinley, reporters began following Proctor around, asking him what his conclusions were from his trip to Cuba, and he refused to say anything. By the time he was ready to speak on March 17th, 1898, there was tremendous interest in what he'd have to say.
I went to Cuba with a strong conviction that the picture had been overdrawn. What I saw I cannot tell so that others can see it. To me, the strongest appeal is not the loss of the man, but the spectacle with 1.5 million people struggling for deliverance from the worst government of which I ever had knowledge.
After Senator Proctor's speech, the business community came around. So McKinley now had the military better prepared. He had the Pacific Fleet ready to go. He had a united business community behind him. And once he had those things coming together, McKinley was changing and was moving towards war.
The final push came on March 25th, when the Naval Committee investigating the Maine explosion reported its findings. The explosion had been caused by a submerged mine. Though the report never fixed responsibility, few doubted that the Spanish were to blame. On April 11th, President McKinley addressed Congress.
In the name of humanity, on behalf of endangered American interests, I ask Congress to authorize the President to take measures to secure a final termination of hostilities and a stable government.
Not in behalf of Cuban independence, but basically to end two competing claims to sovereignty, the Spanish claim of sovereignty and the Cuban claim of sovereignty, and by implication, clearly establish a third claim of sovereignty by force of arms.
Cuban rebel sympathizers in New York were enraged.
This is nothing less than a declaration of war by the United States against the Cuban revolutionaries. We would resist with force of arms as bitterly and tenaciously as we have fought the armies of Spain. Cuban Representative Horatio Rubens.
Senator Henry Teller proposed an amendment that would appease Cuban rebels.
The United States disclaims any intention to exercise control over Cuba, except for pacification, and asserts when that is accomplished to leave the island to its people.
It is true that they have not entered into an accord with our government, but they have recognized our right to be free and independent, and that is enough for me. General Calixto Garcia.
On April 22nd, President McKinley ordered Rear Admiral Sampson to blockade Havana. Spain responded to U.S. naval maneuvers with a declaration of war. Congress immediately followed suit. Halfway around the world in Hong Kong, Commodore Dewey received a dispatch from Secretary of the Navy Long.
Proceed at once to the Philippine Islands. Commence operations against the Spanish fleet. Use utmost endeavors.
A squadron lay at break of day with enemy in view. Each boat and tar had sailed afar, a glorious deed to do. At cannon's mouth our tars will shout, avenge the Maine today. It's Dewey's fleet the foe will meet down at Manila Bay.
Just after midnight on May 1st, 1898, Commodore Dewey's flagship Olympia entered Manila Bay. Dewey's 9 ships, modernized to compete with the navies of Europe, had yet to be tested in battle.
Daylight came out behind Manila and revealed gray fortifications. The binoculars showed a cluster of black hulls. 16 Spanish ships were counted. A shell soared toward our line. The plunge of the projectile was followed by the roar of the gun.
Commodore Dewey's squadron made 5 devastating passes at the Spanish fleet. By noon, the Spanish had surrendered their naval base in Manila Bay. 10 Spanish ships were destroyed. 1 U.S. sailor was killed.
That American forces could win a great victory clear on the far side of the world rendered Dewey's victory in the Philippines more amazing and more noteworthy. And when the news got back to the U.S., Americans rejoiced as they hadn't since the Civil War.
Raise a cheer, all earth can hear.
Dewey was the most famous man in the United States.
Spanish-American War was not only the war that probably got the greatest coverage in the newspapers, but it was also the first filmed war. Every vaudeville theater tried to show what were called actualities of the war. Most of them were faked. Most of the first films of the war were shot on the roof of New York buildings with toy boats and bathtubs, blowing cigar smoke to simulate the smoke of battle.
Dewey, promoted to Rear Admiral, was ordered to wait in Manila Bay for the U.S. Army. To secure the aid of Filipino insurgents, Dewey sent a ship from his fleet to Hong Kong to pick up Emilio Aguinaldo, the exiled leader of the Philippine Revolution. Dewey welcomed Aguinaldo aboard his flagship in Manila Bay.
Dewey gave him the honors of a general of the revolution. They met in the battleship Olympia, and I think Aguinaldo had developed the idea that while the Filipinos would like to be independent, they needed the protection of the United States, because at that time you have the German interest in the area, French interests, also United Kingdom.
Later on, Aguinaldo wrote in his memoirs that Dewey made promises to support the revolution, but there was one thing wrong, and that was there was no written promise made. Aguinaldo wanted to get a promise, but Dewey said, "My word is stronger than the most strongly written statement there is."
I think if I were going to put myself in the shoes of Aguinaldo, being really naive, you know, he was just a simple general in the Philippines. So he took the word of these Americans as, you know, accepted it as true.
Aguinaldo returned to his family's mansion in Cavite, just southwest of Manila, to devise with his generals a strategy to defeat the Spanish.
Compatriots, divine providence is about to place independence within our reach. The Americans have extended their protecting mantle to our beloved country, now that they have severed relations with Spain, owing to the tyranny that nation is exercising in Cuba. The American fleet will prevent any reinforcements coming from Spain. There, where you see the American flag flying, assemble in numbers. They are our redeemers.
When President McKinley called for 200,000 volunteers, more than 1 million Americans responded.
The entire male body of Lafayette College in Pennsylvania volunteered en masse to fight the Spanish in Cuba. The faculty met at Cornell University and decided that anybody who fought in the war would essentially receive credit for it, and that they would not be penalized for going off to war instead of staying back and taking their courses.
There is no division in any part of the land. North and south, east and west, all alike cheerfully respond. From cap and campaign, there comes magic healing, which has closed ancient wounds. President William McKinley.
McKinley was fully aware of the divisiveness of the Civil War. He also was aware of the need to include ex-Confederates in the war effort. And so he took particular pains to appoint veterans of the Civil War to top positions during the Spanish-American War.
President McKinley appointed 61-year-old Confederate veteran Fighting Joe Wheeler, a major general of volunteers, and 330-pound Union officer William Shafter, commander of the Cuban invasion force. Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy when he received his commission to fight in Cuba. His first call was to Brooks Brothers.
One ordinary cavalry uniform for lieutenant colonel with blue cravat.
He'd advocated going into the war, and he was still a young man. He therefore felt he had to put his body where his mouth had been, and so that he'd better live up to his own ideals, so that's why he resigned. Secretary of the Navy, John Davis Long, wrote in his diary that this was a big mistake. And of course, Roosevelt would come out as a big war leader if he stayed in Washington with the Navy Department, because there'd be so much focus on the Navy Department. And of course, if Roosevelt had been killed, it certainly would have been a bad career move, wouldn't it?
Roosevelt joined the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, nicknamed the Rough Riders.
The Rough Rider Regiment summed up a great deal about TR. The regiment was largely composed of Northeastern aristocrats, Ivy League athletes, and of course that was TR's own background. He was a Knickerbocker aristocrat from New York City, and then the regiment was composed also of cowboys and Indians, largely from the West and from the Southwest. Now, what did these guys have in common? This: they didn't need to learn how to shoot or to ride. They didn't need that training, because all rich people, you know, had guns and went hunting and had horses. And of course, cowboys and Indians knew how to ride and shoot. So that's what they had in common. They were ready to go.
In 7 camps from Texas to Florida, new recruits drilled for action in Cuba. With few experienced officers to train them, the volunteers were unprepared for what lay ahead.
There was a correspondent named Pulteney Bigelow who decided he was going to write an article exposing how unready the American troops really were for combat. And he did, and he was ostracized for this quite severely. And denounced as unpatriotic and so forth. But in private, the correspondents really understood that he was correct.
Here we are 30 days after the declaration of war, and not one regiment is yet equipped with uniforms suitable for hot weather. Troops sweat day and night in their cowhide boots, thick flannel shirts, and winter trousers. The poor men have to sleep on the ground in the heavy, dirty sand. Troops are supplied with only greasy pork and beans. The result is that already camp doctors are busy with men and officers suffering from various degrees of dysentery. We hush this up as well as we can, but to do so altogether is impossible. Pulteney Bigelow, Harper's Weekly.
Other reporters struggled with how best to serve their country, whether to continue their coverage of the war or enlist in the military. Richard Harding Davis refused an Army commission. His boss, William Randolph Hearst, yearned to join the Navy.
Unfortunately, Hearst was a huge opponent of McKinley, so there was no way he was going to get a commission. He had to try to find a way in. He wrote McKinley, and he offered to volunteer to give McKinley his fully equipped yachts, if only he could be allowed to sign on board as a naval officer. Nothing happened. Finally, at the last minute, it was becoming more and more embarrassing. He commissioned himself as a foreign correspondent and outfitted a fully equipped steamer with darkroom supplies, enough champagne for 2 weeks to cover the war on his own.
On the 2nd floor of the White House, President McKinley set up his own war room. It was the prototype for the modern military command center.
There were 25 telegraph lines coming into the White House. There were 3 telephone lines, and McKinley exploited them all. He was the first president who understood how you use these new communications, especially the telephone.
The War Room learned on May 19th that a Spanish fleet under Admiral Pascual Cervera had landed in Santiago Bay on the southeast coast of Cuba. The bay's entrance was just 400 feet wide and easily blockaded. Secretary of the Navy Long sent 7 warships to bottle up Cervera's fleet. The Expeditionary Force under General Shafter would attack Santiago by land, forcing the Spanish fleet to either surrender or run the blockade. 25,000 soldiers made their way to Tampa, Florida, chosen as the staging point for the invasion. Officers lounged and gossiped outside their new headquarters, the extravagantly Moorish Tampa Bay Hotel.
Officers who had not met in years, who had been classmates at West Point, who had fought together and against each other in the last war, were left to dangle and dawdle under the electric lights and silver minarets. Richard Harding Davis.
It was quite a scene. I mean, some of these generals had indeed fought in the Civil War. They were elderly men sitting in their rocking chairs on the hotel porch in Tampa. Meanwhile, there was only a narrow gauge railroad, one track coming into Tampa, bringing all this material and men down there. There was a tremendous pileup of boxcars on all the sidings, clear up into Georgia.
To help General Shafter untangle the mess, Commanding General of the Army Nelson Miles went to Tampa. Miles had warned President McKinley against a summer campaign in Cuba. Yellow fever and other tropical diseases would decimate U.S. forces. Rather than delay the invasion, the War Department enlisted 10,000 volunteers thought to be resistant to yellow fever. Tropical ancestry was a qualification. They were called immunes. Almost half were black.
When those brave black knights who are so bold come prancing down the street with swords of Klondike gold, proud plumed darkies looking fine will shine while marching as a black KP.
The Negro has no reason to fight for Cuba's independence. He is opposed at home. He is as much in need of independence as Cuba is. The African-American Washington B.
Legal segregation in the Army reflected that of the broader society. So many African Americans opposed black participation in the war, believing that African Americans would be foolish to participate in a war abroad when their rights were being trampled upon at home.
You go, I'll go with you. Open your mouth, I'll speak for you. Lord, if I go, tell me what to say. They won't believe in me.
Shall the Negro go to war and fight for the country's flag? Yes. Yes, for every reason of true patriotism. He will have an opportunity of proving to the world his real bravery, worth, and manhood. The Los Angeles Freeman.
They won't believe in me. You go.
4 regular black regiments were among the first to arrive in Tampa. They were not received hospitably.
They won't believe in me.
If you can imagine within a Jim Crow social order predicated on the subordination of blacks, the appearance of masses of black soldiers in uniform was a direct threat to white supremacy. So there were numerous altercations, some of them quite violent, in Tampa.
On June 6th, drunken white Ohio volunteers seized a local black child. They came up with a contest. The winner was a soldier who sent a bullet through the sleeve of the boy's shirt. Though the child survived, the incident enraged black troops. They stormed the streets of Tampa, wrecking the saloons and cafes that had refused them service.
There was no need to send Negro troops to Cuba. Now to send them after this event is criminal. The Atlanta Constitution.
From Santiago Bay, Rear Admiral Sampson sent a dispatch to Washington.
Bombarded forts at Santiago today, June 6th. If 10,000 men were here, we could take the city and fleet within 48 hours. Every consideration demands immediate Army movement.
In Tampa, General Shafter announced the embarkation for Cuba. a free-for-all ensued.
The scene in Tampa was just chaotic, with people fighting to get on board ships and elbowing other guys aside to get on board ships, and no staff officers there to help, and no plan or rhyme or reason to it. This was all brand new, and they were just terrible at it. Shafter was handling problems that no American Army officer had before ever had to handle. This was a general staff that had been built to fight the Indian Wars. And all of a sudden, they're going to undertake the most difficult of all military operations, an amphibious offensive against a defended shoreline.
The Rough Riders became an infantry regiment because there wasn't sufficient space on the ships to bring these horses over. TR just moved ahead very aggressively to make sure that his boys got a place on the boats. As it was, not all the Rough Riders did get on transports, and many of them were left behind with the horses in Tampa, Florida.
10,000 troops and much of the ammunition and medical supplies never made it aboard. For the 15,000 soldiers who departed for Cuba on June 14th, the confusion in Tampa seemed far behind.
Today, we are steaming southward through a sapphire sea. Wind rippled under an almost cloudless sky. If we are allowed to succeed, we have scored the first triumph in what will be a world movement. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt.
A week later, the treacherous shoreline was a sobering sight for U.S. troops. General Shafter directed his ships to Daiquiri, 22 miles east of Santiago, where his soldiers could disembark onto a small dock. Cuban insurgents had driven Spanish forces from the area so that the U.S. Army could land unopposed.
So you get this scene in the D-Day for 1898. The guys come down off the ships into the rowboats, pretty heavy sea, and they're coming into a wharf. And when they get on a rise, they have to throw their weapons up onto the wharf, and then down they go again, and then they rise again, and they grab up for guys that are up there on top to help them to get out. And of course, this didn't do any good with their horses and mules. You couldn't take them in on rowboats. What are you going to do with them? Well, you throw them overboard, and they'll swim to shore, and then you gather them up.
TR had 2 horses for his own use, which had been put on the ships. One horse was named Rain in the Face, and one was Texas. They lowered Rain in the Face into the water. Rain in the Face died, drowned, in place before the harnesses got off. At the same point, little Texas went right into the drink. His head came up, he looked around, and he started swimming out to sea. On the shore, the bugler saw this and began blowing. And Texas heard the bugle call and turned around and started swimming into shore.
The next day, the U.S. landing continued at Siboney, a beachhead 7 miles west of Daiquiri.
The cowboys and Indians couldn't swim. They'd never really seen water. The cowboys kept referring to the ocean as the crick. And when they got ashore, of course, their uniforms were wool, they were hot, and the dye started coming off. And most of them stripped down and just wore their sombreros. So by the end of the day, you had all these new Rough Riders with cowboy hats on, working in the surf, trying to get stuff in.
1,000 naked men were assisting and impeding the progress shoreward of their comrades. An army was being landed with more cheers and shrieks and laughter than rise from bathers in the surf at Coney Island. Richard Harding Davis.
Once ashore, U.S. troops encountered Cuban rebels for the first time.
Well, the American soldiers had been reading stories about Cuba in the press, and they were completely unprepared for the reality of it. These rebel soldiers didn't have uniforms. Often they didn't have guns. They were dirt poor, starving men in rags, and also they were largely black.
I thought from their appearance that they would prove useful as guides and scouts, but that we would have to do practically all the fighting. Captain John Bigelow, Jr., 10th Cavalry.
And so the immediate effect of the U.S. arrival is to appropriate the conduct of the war. And so we now begin what becomes known as the Spanish-American War, in which the very title of it signifies the absence of Cubans.
Images of U.S. soldiers preparing their advance were captured by cameramen sent to Cuba by Thomas Edison. The size of early cameras prevented the filming of actual battles, so Edison shot reenactments in New Jersey. In reality, U.S. soldiers were unready for their first encounter with the Spanish. 27-year-old author Stephen Crane, a reporter for the New York World, marched alongside Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. They reached Las Guasimas, 3 miles north of Siboney, on June 24th.
Theodore Roosevelt was rather typical in some ways of these leaders who had very little combat experience. Stephen Crane happened to notice that he kept hearing these sounds of a dove, this coo, 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 and he thought he recognized that as the signal used by the Spanish scouts. Roosevelt wouldn't listen to this when the Cubans warned him that the Spanish were around, and they did walk right into a terrible ambush.
And so the potential asset of the Cuban rebels was not exploited to anywhere near the degree that it could have been. Rebels can supply our intelligence. They're there on the scene. They can say, there's a Spanish company over here, and they got some artillery over here, and that bridge isn't defended, and you can count on that intelligence. It's the best intelligence of all. I saw it.
The Spanish killed and wounded 16 U.S. soldiers before withdrawing to the San Juan Heights, just east of Santiago. From atop the ridge of Las Guasimas, General Shafter and his aides surveyed the terrain.
I don't think there was any great debate about what had to be done. They decided to mount a two-prong attack, one on the San Juan Heights, which stood between them and Santiago, and the other on El Caney, where the Spanish had amassed a sizable military force, which would be on the Americans' right flank as they fought in the San Juan Hills.
General Shafter ordered his commanders to attack both El Caney and the San Juan Heights at dawn on July 1st. At El Caney, 5,000 U.S. troops faced 500 well-entrenched Spanish defenders.
The American battery kept up a leisurely fire on the stone fort, eliciting no reply, and so little disturbing the Spanish that someone suggested they were dummies. Captain Arthur Lee, British military attaché.
The Spaniards then aimed their volleys on our attacking line. We dropped to the ground and fired at will. Men fell in front of me, to my right and left. Private Edward Henry, 21st Infantry.
It was not until late afternoon that U.S. forces had taken El Caney. Among those wounded was New York Journal reporter James Creelman, who had tried to recover the Spanish flag from atop the stone fort.
James Creelman got carried away, and he had his pistol. He drew his pistol and started shooting and ran up the hill and took a bullet in the back and fell over, thought he was dying. And the next thing he knew was he woke from his daze, and there was Hearst leaning over him, wearing a straw hat with a nice ribbon in it. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry you're shot, but wasn't it a splendid fight? We beat all the other newspapers."
This was just wonderful for the newspapers. Coming out of Depression, all the news had been bad news. Here came a war, and it was a glorious war to cover. Exotic place, an enemy that it was easy to despise, real heroes, all the color of the Rough Riders.
That same day, the Rough Riders and 9,000 other U.S. troops, including 3 black regiments, formed southwest of El Caney to take the San Juan Heights. U.S. commanders planned first to cross the San Juan River at the base of the heights, then to take Kettle Hill, just west of the San Juan River. And last, to seize the blockhouse atop San Juan Hill, Spain's final stronghold before Santiago.
We piled up all our extra baggage, nothing but our arms, ammunition, and canteens being needed, and advanced with our colonel down into the San Juan River. And there it was terrible. Just one continual roar of small arms, cannon, and bursting shells. Corporal John Kahn, 24th Infantry.
I had the troopers taking advantage of every scrap of cover. But the Spanish swept the whole edge of the river, and man after man in our ranks fell, dead or wounded. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt.
It soon became apparent to Roosevelt that it wouldn't be any more dangerous for them to charge up the hill than it would be for them to stay where they were. So they charged up the hill. The hill, by the way, was not San Juan Hill. It was part of the San Juan Ridge, but it was Kettle Hill.
No sooner were we on the crest than we had a splendid view of the charge on the San Juan blockhouse to our left, where the infantry were climbing the hill. Suddenly, above the cracking of the carbines rose a peculiar drumming sound. It's the Gatlings, men! Our Gatlings! Colonel Theodore Roosevelt.
The Spanish had never seen this kind of weapon before. It scared them because it was hundreds of rounds a minute pouring into their positions, and it didn't take long before they just turned tail and ran down the other side of San Juan Hill.
U.S. forces captured the San Juan Heights at the cost of 140 American men. But history would assign the glory to only one.
The number one image of the Spanish-American War in the minds of the American people is Teddy Roosevelt on his horse, standing out there all by himself, Spanish sharpshooters up there shooting at him, obviously the most visible target by far on the battlefield, telling his guys, not charge, follow me.
In the course of battle, Roosevelt combined elements of 6 separate regiments, including the African-American 9th and 10th Cavalries.
Now, at that point, most of the black soldiers had become separated from their officers. Roosevelt went up and told the black soldiers that, you know, he was taking over, that he was the ranking officer, and they were to follow him. And he announced at the time that if any man went to the rear, retreated, or ran, he'd shoot him.
This was the end of the trouble with the smoked Yankees, as the Spaniards called the colored soldiers, who flashed their white teeth at one another as they broke into broad grins, seeming to accept me as one of their own officers. Occasionally, the colored troops can take initiative, precisely like the best class of whites. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt.
His statement was uncalled for and uncharitable, considering the effect the 10th Cavalry had in weakening the forces opposed to the colonel's regiment. I will say that when our soldiers tell what they saw, the public will learn that not every company of colored soldiers was led or urged forward by its white officer. Presley Holiday, 10th Cavalry.
Entrenched 600 yards from Santiago, the U.S. Army awaited orders to proceed.
The defenses of Santiago were constructed with commendable skill. To take the city by assault would cost us at least 3,000 men. General Fighting Joe Wheeler.
But Spain's unwillingness to surrender its fleet would spare American soldiers the bloodshed. On July 3rd, less than 2 weeks after the U.S. Army had landed in Cuba, the Spanish Admiral Cervera confronted Rear Admiral Sampson's blockade of Santiago Bay.
We saw what probably has not been witnessed since the days of the Armada. Ships coming out for deadly battle, but dressed as for a regal parade. They bespoke luxury and chivalry, and a proud defiance. George Graham, Associated Press.
Admiral Cervera's fleet swung westward, but could not sail beyond the firing range of the U.S. Navy. Within 3 hours, all Spanish ships but one were destroyed.
The Oregon commenced to gain on us, and soon after opened fire with her heavy bow guns. I decided to run ashore and lose the ship, rather than sacrifice in vain the lives of all these men. Spanish Captain José de Paredes.
I think it's probably symbolic and maybe even significant that the last ship, the very last ship to be sunk, which signals the end of the Spanish Empire in many ways in the New World, is the Columbus. That's the final ship that goes down in the Battle of Santiago.
Nine days later, under the shade of a great ceiba tree, General Shafter began negotiations for the surrender of Santiago. As commanding general of the army, Nelson Miles had warned President McKinley. Disease struck U.S. soldiers.
He knew, and it was certain, and in fact it did happen, that virtually all the American troops were going to get malaria. And as many as 25% of them would be down at any one time. And by down, I mean flat on the back, unable to operate at all. And then in July, the yellow fever was going to start.
The growing death toll convinced General Shafter to accept the conditional surrender of Santiago. Spain could not afford to ship its own army back from Cuba. Shafter agreed to send home 23,000 Spanish soldiers at U.S. expense. Disease would take the lives of more than 2,000 U.S. troops, nearly 5 times the number of fatalities from combat.
Each morning we would hear bugles blowing taps very shortly after reveille. First the burial detail, then the bugle. The sickness was striking in harder. One bugle followed another throughout the day, almost as if they were but echoes among the hills. Private Charles Post, 71st Infantry.
On July 17th in Santiago's main square, U.S. and Spanish generals assembled for the formal surrender of the city. When the cathedral's clock struck noon, the Spanish flag, which had flown over Santiago for nearly 400 years, was replaced by the Stars and Stripes, not the flag of Cuba Libre. Cuban insurgents were not invited to attend.
The reasons given for the denial to enter the city was that they would plunder and they would pillage and that they would loot and they would sack. And so in addition to the sentimental dimension of this decision, the Cubans felt that they were slandered.
We are a poor, ragged army, as poor as was the army of your forefathers in their noble war for independence. But like the heroes of Saratoga and Yorktown, we respect our cause too deeply to disgrace it with barbarism and cowardice. General Calixto Garcia.
The Cubans were now characterized as slouchers, as people who really had no understanding of freedom, of liberty, that these were people who themselves were fundamentally unfit for self-government.
Self-government? Why, those people are no more fit for self-government than gunpowder is for hell. As I view it, we have taken Spain's war upon ourselves. General William Shafter.
In a little rustic cottage in the far-off Philippines sits a little black-faced maiden all alone.
Spain's army in the Philippines was trapped in Intramuros, a walled city within Manila, built by Spanish conquerors 300 years earlier. Aguinaldo's insurgents had besieged the stronghold for nearly 2 months.
They had gotten Manila almost completely surrounded to the extent that the Spaniards were running low on water and food. And Aguinaldo at this point asked the Spanish commander to surrender Manila to his forces. But the Spaniards, with their sense of pride, refused to do that. They feared that the Filipinos would take vengeance on them, that the Filipinos would murder them and rape their women.
Aguinaldo hoped that Rear Admiral Dewey's fleet would bombard Intramuros and force the Spanish to surrender to the Filipinos. But Dewey had been waiting for U.S. land troops, who began arriving in July.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their redeemers, their liberators, and so for as long as Dewey's fleet was there, it was all right. But when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos began to have their doubts and became suspicious about American motives. The American soldiers, on the other hand, arrived thinking that they were really going to educate these people, and a lot of them equated the Filipinos with blacks, Negroes, and they looked down on many of them.
The Filipinos were portrayed by the press in a very different way from, say, the way that the Cubans had been portrayed prior to the U.S. intervention. What was more common was to portray the Filipinos as children, so that Uncle Sam would have to come in and establish a kindergarten and would educate the Filipinos for self-government.
The Spanish proposed surrendering to the United States in a mock battle for Manila. Few soldiers would be harmed, and the Spanish would maintain their military honor. Filipinos would be kept out of Intramuros by the U.S. Army.
The Battle of Manila was another one of these things where the Spanish did not want to simply raise their hands in the air and come out surrendering. It was almost like the reenactments that you see today of Civil War battles. Everybody knew who was going to win.
The Spaniards raised the white flag, the Americans rushed into the city as planned, and the Filipinos were left holding an empty bag. Before they knew what had hit them, they were still surrounding Manila, but Manila had changed hands into the Americans.
On August 14th, in the Church of San Agustin, the Spanish handed over formal possession of Manila to the United States. And like General Garcia at Santiago, Aguinaldo and his insurgents were barred from entering the city. Filipino leaders retreated to a monastery north of Manila to organize a government independent of the United States.
The people struggle for their independence, absolutely convinced that the time has come when they can and should govern themselves. Emilio Aguinaldo.
Our country called, they hasten on to fight for freedom's cause, for victory of our country's flag, for just and righteous laws.
Peace negotiations between the United States and Spain began in Paris on October 1st, 1898. No Filipinos or Cubans had been consulted or invited to attend. Their fate lay in the hands of 10 American and Spanish delegates.
I think at this point, McKinley was not sure in his own mind exactly what he would ask of the Spanish. He was sure that he would ask them to give up Cuba. The real question was what to do with the Philippines. And he decided that he needed the port of Manila in the Philippines in order to have a naval base in the Western Pacific. The question was, how much more than Manila should we have in order to protect Manila?
Congressional elections were just a month away. As President McKinley toured the Midwest to campaign for Republicans, he gauged public opinion on overseas expansion.
We have good money, We have ample revenues. We have unquestioned national credit, but we want new markets. And as trade follows the flag, it looks very much as if we are going to have new markets.
He made speeches in which he would pose the problem something like this. We have established American interests in the flag in the Philippines. Should we take the flag down? And of course, the audience would roar back, no. Should we keep the Philippines as an overseas base? The audience would roar its approval. And McKinley would say, well, I guess they want the Philippines.
The Republicans maintained their majority in Congress. Theodore Roosevelt was elected governor of New York. 5 days later, U.S. treaty negotiators in Paris were cabled President McKinley's terms.
Insist upon the cession of the whole of the Philippines. If necessary, pay to Spain $20 million. Secretary of State John Hay.
Spain accepted the offer and gave up the Philippines and Cuba, in addition to Guam and Puerto Rico. The 400-year-old Spanish Empire, which once included most of the Western Hemisphere, ended with the stroke of a pen. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, required ratification by at least 2/3 of the U.S. Senate.
The U.S. Senate has historically billed itself as the most deliberative body in the world, and often it doesn't live up to that reputation. But in the debate over the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, I think it did. Despite the overblown rhetoric on both sides, there was a critical issue that was being debated. Should the United States become an imperial power?
This treaty will make us a vulgar, commonplace empire, controlling subject races and vassal states, in which one class must forever rule and other classes must forever obey.
Providence has given the United States the duty of extending Christian civilization. We come as ministering angels, not despots.
Every schoolboy knows that the Revolutionary War was fought against the colonial system of Europe. No power is given to the federal government to acquire territory to be held as colonies.
Suppose we reject the treaty. We continue the state of war. We repudiate the president. We are branded as a people incapable of taking rank as one of the greatest of world powers.
The debate was not confined to Senate chambers. Among those who spoke out against the treaty were leaders of the Democratic opposition.
When the desire to steal becomes uncontrollable in an individual, he is declared to be a kleptomaniac. When the desire to grab land becomes uncontrollable in a nation, we are told that the currents of destiny are flowing in the hearts of men.
They don't think it's possible for a democracy to be an empire, that trying to rule an empire thousands of miles abroad, they're convinced will corrupt American democratic institutions. But they also can't imagine absorbing the peoples of the Philippines in any form into the American Republic.
Is the Republic to remain one homogeneous whole, one united people, or to become a scattered and disjointed aggregate of widely separated and alien races? Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie.
Part of the treaty terms with Spain included $20 million for the Philippines. Carnegie, apparently sincerely, offered to pull out his checkbook and write a check to the United States government for $20 million, and in return for which he wanted McKinley to give the Philippines their independence.
Carnegie and former President Cleveland petitioned the Senate to reject the treaty, still 2 votes shy of ratification. The final vote was scheduled for February 6, 1899. In Manila, U.S. and Filipino soldiers eyed each other suspiciously across a neutral divide. Just 2 days before the final Senate vote, a U.S. Army private on patrol spotted 2 Filipino soldiers crossing the San Juan Bridge to American lines. He shouted for the soldiers to halt.
A Filipino soldier would not understand the word halt.
So ignoring that warning continued. He continued to move towards the American lines. The Americans fired from their end, and there was now a reply on the Filipino end.
There's a strong sentiment that flashes through the Senate that we have to support our boys in the Philippines. I mean, it's like there was a patriotism aroused instead of doubts. I mean, the fighting in the Philippines causes a lot of people to have doubts, but in the Senate, it has the impact of turning a number of people who were thinking of opposing the treaty into supporting it.
2 Democrats switched sides, and the Senate narrowly ratified the treaty. The United States officially acquired its first colonies and its first colonial rebellion. 60 U.S. soldiers and 700 Filipinos had been killed.
One of the great sardonic writers of the time, Ambrose Bierce, once wrote that taking an empire is not like smoking a cigarette. And the people who came to be known as anti-imperialists were of that view. And one of them said, Dewey took Manila with the loss of one man and all our institutions.
Come home, Dewey, we won't do a thing to you. Grand old hero of the red, white, and blue. 70 million people with nothing else to do. Wait for your coming and they'll make it warm for you.
Rear Admiral Dewey doubled his order of ammunition from Washington to help put a swift end to the Filipino insurrection.
The insane attack of these people upon their liberators. It is not likely that Aguinaldo himself will exhibit much staying power. After 1 or 2 collisions, the insurgent army will break up. The New York Times, February 1899.
To avoid an uprising in Cuba, U.S. officials appealed to General Gomez to demobilize his troops.
The Cuban army cannot dissolve itself unless I receive the assurance that independence will be given to Cuba. General Maximo Gomez.
Cubans gained faith in the United States when it began extensive programs to improve public works on the island.
Electricity was introduced, the telegraph was expanded, the railroads were repaired and cleaned up, swamps were drained, roads were paved so that you wouldn't have standing water. And in fact, this made a tremendous difference among the population of Cuba.
General Gomez agreed to disband the Cuban army, hoping that the United States would in turn honor the Teller Amendment. Passed before the war, the Teller Amendment guaranteed the Cubans their independence. In the Philippines, Aguinaldo's insurgents had no promises of independence, no Teller Amendment. They continued to resist. Within 2 months, they had killed and wounded 500 U.S. soldiers.
Why is it that the American outlook is blacker now than it has been since the beginning of the war? The whole population of the islands sympathizes with the insurgents. The sooner the people of the United States find out that the people of the Philippines do not wish to be governed by us, the better. Harper's Weekly, June 1899.
The Anti-Imperialist League that had begun some months before grew in membership. It's very interesting, especially a number of American women got involved in this. They did not yet have suffrage. They saw the Filipinos essentially as having their problem. That is to say, they were being governed without their having anything to say about it.
Among the most vocal of anti-imperialist women were members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Again and again has my blood boiled at the hundreds of American saloons being established throughout our new possessions. And shame of shames, our military authorities in the Philippines have introduced the open and official sanction of prostitution. Bessie Scoville, Women's Christian Temperance Union.
What really upset WCTU members were the reports of sexually transmitted diseases. And they were just appalled to find out that boys who they described as pure boys had left their their homes and their loving mothers and their strong values and went to the Philippines and instead came home sick, diseased, depraved.
Founder of the Anti-Imperialist League, Edward Atkinson, published pamphlets on venereal disease and sent them to troops in the Philippines.
Atkinson believed that one of the consequences of going into the career of empire was that traditional American principles, such as freedom of speech, would no longer hold. And sure enough, the Postmaster General had the pamphlets seized. And so they never reached the Philippines, and Atkinson was able to go to the public then and say, you see, this is what happens. If we seize the Philippines and go and become an imperialist power, we'll no longer have our freedoms.
In August 1899, the U.S. commander in Manila requested 60,000 reinforcements, quadrupling the size of U.S. forces in the Philippines. Aguinaldo ordered his officers to begin a guerrilla war.
It involved men without uniforms, so they would be able to fade into civilian populations very, very quickly. It involved surprise attacks, raids, without warning. Some of the Filipinos would even wear women's clothing at times to be able to get behind American lines and then hit from the back.
And the way the fighting went on was just utterly alien to the American kids at the beginning of the 20th century in the Philippines, just as it was to the American kids in the late 1960s in Vietnam. And whenever you send an 18 or a 19-year-old out into the world and give them a gun and tell them to go and kill the enemy and to hate the enemy, you're going to have problems. You're going to have the kind of thing that happened at Wounded Knee, or the kind of thing that happened in the Philippines with the American troops torturing their prisoners in the most, you don't want to ever even think about it, ways.
American brutality in the Philippines brought an unexpected supporter to the anti-imperialist movement, William Randolph Hearst.
Letters that were sent to him from American soldiers talked about killing the Filipinos, who they called Indians oftentimes, connecting it to the Indian Wars in the United States. And I think Hearst started seeing that perhaps the whole Spanish-American War was a misadventure, that what possibly worked in Cuba, getting Spain out, was turning out to be disastrous in the Pacific with the Philippines.
Just break the news to Mother. She knows how dear I love her, and tell her not to wait for me, for I'm not coming home.
Talk about dead Indians. Why, they're lying everywhere. The trenches are full of them. Theodore Conley, a Kansas regiment.
Last night, one of our boys was found shot and his stomach cut open. Immediately, orders were received to burn the town and kill every native in sight. I am probably growing hard-hearted, for I am in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger. A.A. Barnes, 3rd U.S. Artillery.
I don't believe the people in the United States understand the condition of things here. Even the Spanish are shocked. I have seen enough to almost make me ashamed to call myself an American, an anonymous soldier.
The body count in the Philippines worried President McKinley. 3,000 Americans and 15,000 Filipinos had been killed. U.S. generals in Manila were ordered to censor reporters' dispatches that contained any unfavorable news.
American reporters in the Philippines blamed the generals, not the president, for this censorship and their inability to get a lot of this news out. So by the early part of 1900, McKinley was in much better shape politically than he should have been, given the number of casualties and the amount of atrocities that were going on in the Philippine Revolution.
I believe he'll boss the job all right. He'll stop the free trade holds up and make the fences tight.
In June 1900, the Republicans gathered in Philadelphia for their national convention. President McKinley was easily renominated, largely because the nation prospered. Teddy Roosevelt was selected as his running mate.
Roosevelt was nominated not because he was governor of New York State,
but because he was a war hero and therefore could add a lot of pizzazz to the Republican ticket.
The election of 1900 was a rematch between McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate in 1896. Bryan hoped to win this election by making the Philippines a central issue. On November 6th, Bryan carried only 4 states, and not even his native Nebraska. McKinley won by a landslide and became the first president of the 20th century.
Almost never do foreign policy questions decide American elections. McKinley was reelected on the prosperity that his administration had brought to the country after the horrible depression of the 1890s. The fact that Bryan had raised the imperial question allowed the Republicans to claim their victory as a victory for imperialism.
One of the first acts of McKinley's new administration was to offer Cuba limited self-government. The Platt Amendment, introduced by Connecticut Senator Orville Platt, made Cuba a U.S. protectorate. The United States could intervene in Cuba's affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay.
The Platt Amendment was the American guarantee that Cuba would remain American. It undermined any attempt on the Cubans to be autonomous.
The Cubans were told in explicit terms, your choice is a republic with the Platt Amendment or continued military occupation. So it was a terrible dilemma, to accommodate or to resist. And at this point, it was not clear what to do. So much had changed. The army had been demobilized. They had scattered to all ends of the island. And people like General Maximo Gomez were left with this very, very bitter denouement.
This is not the republic we fought for. It is not the independence we dreamed about. But there is no gain in discussing that now. We must save what remains of the redemptive revolution. General Maximo Gomez.
The Cubans bowed to U.S. pressure and narrowly voted the Platt Amendment into their constitution. In the Philippines, U.S. troops had posed as prisoners of war to infiltrate rebel headquarters. 3 weeks after President McKinley's March inauguration, they captured rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo.
There has been enough blood, enough tears, enough desolation. By accepting the sovereignty of the United States, I believe I am serving thee, our beloved country. Emilio Aguinaldo.
While war continued in the southern Philippines, there were few skirmishes around Manila in the summer of 1901. President McKinley appointed William Howard Taft the first civilian governor of the Philippines. Big Bill Taft called the Filipinos his little brown brothers. McKinley described Taft's mission as one of benevolent assimilation.
What was established here very quickly were schools and the introduction of American methods of education, English language, except that the American administration in the Philippines passed a law which made illegal anything that was anti-American, whether it was written, spoken, or even a picture. The Philippine flag was banned, although Filipinos found other ways to continue the struggle.
To see the Pan American, I went to Buffalo. I saw the great exhibits that this nation had to show in Buffalo, in Buffalo. The curiosities I saw, they really made me smile. You can see more sights on Sunday on the beach at Coney
On September 5th, 1901, President McKinley visited the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He spoke about the nation's New World role.
We have a vast and intricate business built up through years of toil and struggle, in which every part of this country has its stake. Isolation is no longer possible or desirable.
He was the first president who had ever said this, who had essentially told Americans they now had global responsibilities and that they had to start learning foreign languages because they were now competing in a world market.
The next afternoon, President McKinley greeted visitors at a public reception.
He had been warned by his Secret Service detail that there was the danger of assassination. Anarchists had assassinated several figures in Europe, particularly European royalty, and there had been threats made on McKinley's life. McKinley would not listen to these warnings, and he insisted upon meeting people one by one as they came through the hall at the Buffalo Exposition.
A Bach sonata murmured quietly from the reception hall, broken suddenly by 2 shots. Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist, had fired a revolver concealed by a handkerchief. One bullet deflected harmlessly off a button on the president's shirt. The second lacerated his stomach. President William McKinley died 8 days later. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in.
McKinley, our hero now at rest.
10 days after President McKinley's death, the residents of Balangiga, a tiny village 400 miles southeast of Manila, attacked the local U.S. garrison. While U.S. soldiers ate breakfast, the church bells rang a signal. Filipinos brandishing machetes emerged from their hiding places. 48 Americans, 2/3 of the garrison, were butchered.
To the Filipinos, this was seen as a victorious battle on the side of the revolution, but to the Americans, it was seen as an atrocity of the gravest proportions.
On the orders of General Jacob Smith, U.S. troops retaliated against the entire island of Samar, where Balangiga is located.
I want no prisoners. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms against the United States.
I'd like to know the limit of age to respect, sir.
10 years. General Jacob Smith.
And his troops followed the order to the letter, burning villages, killing men, and actually even women and children, and converting Samar into really a howling wilderness.
Oh, I'm only a common soldier in the blasted Philippines. They say I've got brown brothers here, but I don't know what it means. I like the word fraternity, but still I draw the line. Oh, he may be a brother of Big Bill Taft, but he ain't no brother of mine.
In Batangas, a province south of Manila, U.S. officers herded all non-insurgents into fortified zones. Everyone outside these zones was considered an enemy and captured or killed. The similarities to Spanish methods in Cuba were unmistakable. Leading anti-imperialist Senator George Hoar insisted on public hearings to try those responsible for these atrocities. 3 Army officers, including General Jacob Smith, were court-martialed.
You have sacrificed nearly 10,000 American lives. You have slain uncounted thousands of the people you desired to benefit. You have established reconcentration camps. Your statesmanship has succeeded in converting a grateful people into enemies possessed of a hatred which centuries cannot eradicate. Senator George Hoar.
In April 1902, after more than 3 years of fighting, Filipino insurgents surrendered to the United States.
By the end of the war, Americans simply had no stomach for any more colonies. Even Roosevelt himself was forced to conclude that the Americans were not an imperial people. He said that the Philippines had become America's Achilles heel.
He should have listened harder in 1898 to a lot of people who were saying at that time, we're going to acquire these foreign people about whom we know very little or nothing, who are way, way far away, who have a culture that is not a part of ours, that's just south of Japan. They're good. If we have those islands, it's going to draw us into a war in the Pacific. And it's going to be a very bloody and very tough war to fight.
In World War II, Japan conquered the Philippines. 60,000 Americans and more than 1 million Filipinos were killed driving the Japanese from the islands. Soon after, the United States granted the Filipinos their independence. The U.S. military withdrew from Havana in 1902. While the Cubans could govern their day-to-day affairs, the Platt Amendment allowed the United States to intervene whenever its interests were threatened. The first time was in 1906.
There was political instability in Cuba, and President Theodore Roosevelt sent troops into the island. And I think this was a major turn, because at that point the Cubans began to see the United States as a kind of big brother who would only let them do certain things under certain limitations.
Cuba was given its independence in 1934, but the United States remained a powerful influence in the island's affairs. Resentment in Cuba grew, culminating in another nationalist revolution. Fidel Castro, the son of a Spanish sugar planter, overthrew U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Bautista in 1959.
It is not coincidence that in the final hours of the fall of the Batista government, Fidel Castro on January 1st issues a proclamation talking about the fall of the regime, and then makes this remarkable illusion that this time the Cuban army will not be kept out of the city of Santiago. A resonating reference to 1898. It is as if somehow Cuban history now, in some sort of existential way, has resumed.
To the main memorial in Havana, Castro's government added an inscription: "To the victims of the Maine, who were sacrificed by imperialist greed in its mission to conquer the island of Cuba."
We have remembered the Maine, wiped out the old flag stain, and proudly once more, as in the days of yore, it floats on the breeze again.
In 1911, the Navy decided that it was not what they wanted to have the Maine on the bottom of Havana Harbor with its superstructure sticking up out of the water. And they thought it would be more seemly to refloat the Maine and take it out to sea and sink it there. And that's where things stayed until the 1970s, when the late Admiral Rickover came up with the conclusion that it was not an external explosion, but that it was probably set off by a spontaneous combustion fire in the coal bunker. It's ironic because the explosion set off this series of events and changed us in ways that could never be reversed.
We have remembered the Maine.
To learn more about the Spanish-American War, visit PBS online at pbs.org.
Before the Maine went down, mothers and matrons and sweethearts in hamlet and village and town prayed for and wrote to their daughters
a production of South Carolina ETV. Major funding for Crucible of Empire was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Funding was also provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.